Happy Halloween.
Serpents from the Garden of Eos. Volume 2. The Atlantis of Hellas in the Middle Sea. Section E1D. The Hinterlands of Sardinia. The Pyramid of Akkadi on Sardinia. Ozieri tribes, 6,000 to 5,000 BAS. Section Introduction. Some 500 years after the Neolithic Egyptians landed upon Crete's south coast, they continued with their voyages of discovery into the Mediterranean Sea. Guided by the stars of the Serpent, these first pioneer settlers sailed over the unmapped waters of night towards the future land of Hellas. Beaching upon the unknown peninsula of Pelops, these Argonauts of starry Nu next ventured either west or east. The explorations made by the seafarers of the Nile into the vastness of the Middle Sea beyond the nearer island of Crete commenced at approximately 8,500 BAS. Half a millennium had passed since these nautical explorers had become the lone settlers of the great island in the midst of primordial night. Responding to the unquenchable human desire for exploring the unknown, groups of later Nilotic immigrants who followed upon the first Cretans set out for more distant voyages beyond the dark horizon of the coiled serpent. Those boats that sailed an easterly course from the Pelop Argolid made a landfall in Attica and Thessaly. The Thessalian village of Sesklo was founded as an early frontier farming community at about this period. These newcomer agriculturalists discovered rich, fertile alluvial soils in the river valleys of the plains, and a native population of primitive, roving hunters that prowled the wilds of the surrounding hills and dwelled in large caverns. Those boats that sailed westerly found the same native hunters of the previous epoch living close by the coastline, where they fished the sea and did some regional trade in crafts, flint, and obsidian. An excavation at a cave near the tip of the Peloponnesus has shown that it was continuously occupied from the Paleolithic into the Neolithic period. The hunter-gatherers of the Paleolithic living in this cave had many saltwater fish and crustaceans in their diets, and their crafts included many items made of obsidian obtained from the Cycladic island of Melos, indicating that at least some of the primitive natives used their dugout boats for fishing and local sea travel, not long before the first weed planting magic science arrived from the Nile. The Memphis Deltanauts did then encounter native populations of humans elsewhere in the Great Sea of Nu, though these tribes were still existing as their own Paleolithic ancestors had, by the hunting, scavenging, and gathering of their food. The colonists who journeyed to the west following the coastline progressed most rapidly in their establishment of new coastal settlements because of their mode of travel over the water. Very broadly, it is so that within another 5 centuries of their first departing the initial base of Crete, these exploring farmers had initialized new Egyptian pioneer communities throughout the Mediterranean Sea, from Iberia and Sardinia in the west unto Thessaly and the Balkans in the east. After passing the Peloponnesus of Hellas, that great large island peninsula of the mainland, the next exploratory voyages were made into the Adriatic Sea, at first along the coasts of what are today Albania and Croatia. In terms of artifacts, these first hardy explorers left behind what are described as a type of impressed ware of pottery. It is this distinctive style of primitive ceramic that has come to be the prime indicator of their first landfalls along the coast of the sea, where large caves were often used as sheltering domiciles along the route of exploratory expansion from harbors on Crete. The Egyptian pioneers carried with them not only the new magic science of weed planting, but also a new cult of the primordial religion of Anu and Nu. The epoch of exploration into the Sea of Nu was rapidly advanced when it commenced with the first voyages beyond the great island floating upon the azimuth of the coiled serpent. The majority of coastal landfalls made by these first navigators of the unknown deeps of Nu have mostly been dated to within 100 years or so of the middle 9th millennium BAS. This is the century of the earliest Neolithic finds in Hellas, of the earliest villages in Thessaly. Their progress was extremely fast in exploring the coastline of Paleolithic Europe, as compared with the land route expansion into the Balkans, due to the greater ease of sea travel. Whereas thousands of years were required for the exploration and settlement of the Danube Valley into the interior hinterlands, that of the sea route was accomplished within a few hundred years at most. It is not surprising, therefore, to find that most of the coastal sites of initial habitation by these early navigators occurred at nearly the same moment, and especially as seen through the lens of archaeology, with its accurate, though imprecise, estimates of exact chronology focusing on so distant a period of epochal prehistory. The earliest Neolithic wheat-growing villages in Italy are also from the middle of the 9th millennium BAS, established within this same 8500 BAS century of exploration from Crete and Egypt, Crete itself having only been first colonized at approximately 9000 BAS. These first farming communities in Italy are all within the Gargano Peninsula, that is, the spur of the Italian boot projecting into the Adriatic Sea opposite from Croatia and the Illyrian mainland. They were settled by the navigators of Nu at around 8500 BAS, and these Neolithic farmers used the same style of impressed ware pottery as all the other colonizers of the Middle Sea did. The later pottery of these farmers shows some improvement over the basic impresso ware of their navigator ancestors, where a somewhat more advanced style has been found in the Scaloria cave of Gargano. Fragments of 1500 different vases were found in this cave with an impresso style similar to that popular in the later stages of Sesclo and Starcevo villages. Footnote number 1. This cave was obviously important to the worship of the night goddess herself, and her viziers of the supernatural underworld of death and reincarnation, the serpent gods of the life-sustaining cereal weeds. This can be seen from the sacred glyph decorations of the slightly more advanced pottery produced by the farmer descendants of the first immigrants, found within the cave depths where they were left as votive offerings to these gods of the otherworld. The entire mythic pantheon may have been appeased by offerings made within this natural abode of earth, since most of the vases were left nearby a pool of waters in the cavern depths, and the goddess of dark waters was an elder sibling of the serpent gods. This, of course, was Eos, the daughter closely attached to the night and earth goddess in her role as the primordial sea of creation. Torches from the entrance fire of Eros could then have provided the illumination of the stalagmite passages. Scaloria Cave later gave its name to the fourth and most advanced stage of the impresso style of ceramics. Besides Sardinia, southeast Italy, Croatia, and Hellas, the impresso-ware of ceramics is found at coastal settlements in Sicily and Tuscany also. The Stentinello is the name given to the first navigators of Nu on the island of Sicily, and their earliest pottery is of the same basic impresso style as that found at Gargano villages and elsewhere. The first Neolithic settlers on Sardinia voyaged to the island from nearby Corsica and Tuscany, where sites of early Neolithic farming communities that used this pottery style have also been found. Footnote number 1. Gimbutas, the civilization of the goddess, pages 157-162. Gimbutas describes the Neolithic villages of Gargano and the Scaloria cave style of pottery in relation to the old European goddess-worshipping civilization. The caves of the North Sardinian coast, the other side of the bay from the modern town of Alghero, are perhaps at the location of the first landfall of these sea-exploring farmers. One of these caves, named Grota Verde, has produced artifacts from the earliest Neolithic settlers who used the impresso style of ceramics. Artifacts from later Neolithic ancestors of these first explorers have also been found in this same cave. It is highly likely that Grota Verde later came to be used as a cave sacred to the cult of the religion of night, when the descendants of these first weed-growing colonists built and lived in the first villages on the island. The Neolithic history of the island of Sardinia can be divided into three main periods based on the main stage of civilization within each of the millennia of the Neolithic epoch. The first stage is the Impresso Filiestru millennium of the early Neolithic that actually encompasses some 1,500 years, from 8,500 to 7,000 BAS. The Middle Neolithic civilization has been given the name of the Bonu Iginu, after a cave in an inland valley of that name that was in use by later descendants of the tribe from at least 7,000 BAS to 6,000 BAS, and even longer into the late Neolithic. The Ozieri stage of the tribe is the most advanced of the epoch and occurs in the late Neolithic millennium from 6,000 BAS to 5,000 BAS. Note that this 5,000 BAS date is a rough estimation for the start of the dynastic period in Egypt after the first war between the Lower and Upper Egyptian kingdoms and the unification of the mainland into one political unity ruled by the Old Kingdom dynasties. The Ozieri stage of the descendant Sardanu tribe is then approximately contemporary with the pre-dynastic kingdoms of Lower and Upper Egypt, before the unification that came after the first war between the moon and the sun. Although it is in the early Neolithic of the Impresso-Filiestru stage that the first primitive villages were built upon the island of Sardinia by the descendants of the navigators of Nu, it is only in the next Bonu Iginu stage of the Middle Neolithic that these first farming communities proliferate and multiply over the entire island. Finally, by the stage of the most advanced communities in the late Neolithic Osieri millennium, you have the first megalithic structures being made for use as temples, palaces, and fortresses. The Osieri are also known for their use of giant or titanic building techniques for domestic and funereal purposes, and some of the many dolmen and menhir pillars found on the island were placed by these prehistoric stone architects. The Sardanu is the name of the Bronze Age tribes that lived on Sardinia after the 5000 BAS unification in Egypt produced the first dynasties of the Old Kingdom. The Sardanu were obviously the descendants of the previous Osieri stage of civilization for the most part, although there is some possibility of further colonization from the eastern regions of the Mediterranean Sea by a people of the Anatolian coast, where there was an ancient city of nearly the same name called Sardis. The Greek historian Herodotus, in his history, relates some folklore having to do with expeditions made by some Ionians of the region into the vicinity of the Tyrrhenian Sea. Footnote number 2. Based on information from Herodotus, there was a tribal group that were formerly citizens of Crete who much later may have helped with some addition of new colonists to Sardinia, linking the former subjects of the Sea Empire of Atlantis with their more western island cousins. This, however, as the early Neolithic migration from Egypt and Crete shows, was not necessary to produce the Sardanu civilization on the island, which can easily be explained by the already indigenous population of new navigator descendants. By the era of the first war in Egypt between the moon and the sun, the civilization of the Egyptian Neolithic had already spread into the far reaches of the Middle Sea of Nu. The island of Sardinia and the other coastal areas of the sea had already produced a level of civilization that was somewhat similar to that of the Egypts, and these areas had a common religion as well as a common technology, and a trade network that was established between themselves, where they did then exist within farming localities administered by towns and, most likely, some type of regional hegemony. The Sardanu civilization appears to have been organized around local city-states in the same way as the Mycenaeans were in Hellas. The hundreds of new Roghi fortress castles that dot the Sardinian landscape were once the centers of individual townships or city-states, no doubt ruled by feudal lords in the same fashion as were the Mycenaean towns of Hellas. Agamemnon and Odysseus and Achilles must have had their Sardanu counterparts on this western island who ruled each locality from the town that owned the farmlands round about each of them. The ruling hierarchy that governed these townships was most likely composed of a feudal nobility with their attendant administrative, military, and priestly castes that were subordinate to them. Similar to the Aegean lands of Atlantis and Hellas, these Sardanu city-states were most likely organized into larger monarchical kingdoms that included many different towns and villages administered by the ancient equivalent of barons and counts and bishops. Footnote number 2. Herodotus, History, Clio, number 1, pages 163 to 173. Herodotus relates that the ancestors of some of the Ionian tribes were from Crete and that they had previously been subjects of Minos. There is also a summary of later Ionian explorations into the far seas of the Tarsinians and folklore encounters with Tannic merchants. The ruling elite of the nobility should then have been like those of other civilizations have always been, from the days of ancient Memphis until today's more modern societies, a largely hereditary caste of specialists allowed by, and somewhat necessary for, a complex society producing a surplus of food and materials. The possibilities of human endeavor having categorical limits of sorts within the nature of existence, it is almost assured that the Sardanu elite were specialized into some fashion of administering, defending, or illuminating the activities of the massed farmers who tilled the weed-growing fields and tended the cattle, goats, sheep, and hogs. The many hundreds of these new Roghi fortresses upon the island were built by a most feudal society, producing large amounts of surplus cereal wheat, grains, and livestock. The great multitude of these towns and new Roghi must have been a result brought about by the high fertility of the island's soils and the warlike and feudal structuring of the Sardanu society. Besides castes of administrators and warriors, the Sardanu civilization must have included a large proportion of specialists who had priestly crafts and magical sciences as their area of expertise. This attribute of the society can be seen in the many other megalithic structures that were built, starting with the Ossuary stage of the late Neolithic on the island. These religious structures, such as the pyramid at Akkadi or the necropolis temple at Villa Peruccio, are massive in their size and made of enormous, roughly hewn stones, as at Akkadi, or are chiseled from solid rock, as at Villa Peruccio. The very production of such structures, with their utilization of great amounts of resources and industry, shows that the Sardanu were a most religious people, and certainly, therefore, had a high proportion of their surplus specialists positioned within the craft of nature's magical science. The Sardanu are mentioned by the mainland Egyptians of the New Kingdom as being one of the many tribes that formed the sea raiders who invaded Egypt and brought an end to this dynastic period. Their mention by the Egyptians in the literature of the period includes a formation of Sardanu mercenaries employed by Ramesses II at the Battle of Kadesh, and the illustrations made during the reign of his successor, the later pharaoh Ramesses III, that show Sardanu warriors invading Egypt as formations of the sea raiders. The Sardanu inscriptions made by artists of Ramesses III show Sardanu warriors wearing their horned helmets. This was at the start of the final campaigns in the long and destructive Fourth and Last War. The final Armageddon of night and day that was waged between the lunar alliance led by Atlantis and the solar alliance that was led by mainland Theban Egypt and included its Hittite allies. After the Fourth War between the moon and the sun, the eclipse shadow of the Venusian Dark Age descended over the Western world for the next half of a millennium. When the thick, dusty fog did lift from history at somewhere around 2800 BAS, the entire ancient world of the Middle Sea had changed. The great sea empire of Atlantis had, finally, disappeared forever beneath the waves. The Near Eastern lands of the once vast and mighty solar empire of the Hattusa were barren of a centralized state. The treacherous Greeks of a few Hellenic cities of the sun had perished, and their cities lay smoldering heaps of debris near the Dardanelles and in the Botia of Hellas. Even the borders of eternal Egypt had shrunken in, and the lands along the Nile were again recently unified with river fortifications, though they were as yet uneasily ruled by a different dynasty from a new capital at Tanis in the Delta. Out of the dark voids of 5 centuries emerged a new sea power on the abyss waves of night, and this was the renewed mercantile cities of Phoenicia, home of the Canaanite Philistines, who spoke a mishmash dialect of Greco-Egyptian and wrote a new alphabet derived from the cursive glyphs written by the scribes of Atlantis. These hardy sailors of Tyre and Sidon and Byblos set out on a new exploration and recolonization of the now misty and obscure western lands of the Middle Earth Sea. Perhaps with some surprise, they once more encountered their former allies of the night, where they yet lived in the fortified towns of Tuscany, Sardinia, Sicily, Calabria, and Apulia. Footnote number 3. Recognizing their former friends, they later crowded in amongst them, building new harbor town ports along the western coasts of the Dark Sea to facilitate trade between the east and west. One of these new towns they called Cagliari, and another Tartessos. They even gave a portion of the sea in this area a new moniker, calling it the Tyrrhenian Sea, after one of their cities in the Phoenician homeland. Somewhat later, a queen of Phoenicia, having fallen out with her royal husband over some trivial matter, decided to emigrate to these newfound western lands of plenty with her loyal retinue of substantial ships and numbers. Her name was Queen Dido. This is the legendary Queen Dido that is written of by Virgil in his great Trojan Aeneid, an epic having to do with the mythical adventures of the Trojan refugees after the fall of Troy. It is this same Queen Dido who was, by all mythical accounts, the founder of the Phoenician colony of Carthage upon the coast of Tunis. Carthage became a most successful colony of the Phoenicians, and after some few hundred years, during which it grew by leaps and bounds, it eventually displaced the merchant seafarers of the Phoenician homelands and attained the rulership of the waves in the western seas of the Mediterranean, including nearly the entire island of Sardinia. Footnote number 3, Gimbutas, pages 163-166. Gimbutas, after discussing the early Neolithic settlers of the Gargano villages, goes on to give a general description of the Middle and Late Neolithic ceramic artifacts discovered in South Italy. The Sardanu natives did still exist even by this later era of the Venusian epoch, though they became increasingly either absorbed into Phoenician society or were reduced to living in the isolation of the most remote areas. It is more than likely that this mercantile takeover of the Sardanu by the Phoenicians and Carthaginians was mostly a peaceful process, because there were significant similarities between their civilizations. The Sardanu, previous to this, had been a major trading partner of Atlantis before the Dark Ages, and indeed a trustworthy ally of some importance to the great sea empire of Nyx. They had, for many centuries, been a major outlet for products of the Venusian Isle when it was yet an island of Atlantis. The Phoenicians of the nearby coast merely resumed this trade at some obscure point of the Dark Ages. They were resuming a position held by Atlantis before its final catastrophe caused by the war. In addition to this, along with a possible similarity of language, there was the definite close similarity of religion that linked the Sardinia and Phoenician civilizations. That this was obviously so can be seen from the religious artifacts of the Sardinia. They kept the same religion from the early Neolithic of the cavern-dwelling and weed-growing explorers down into the Phoenician arrival in the new dawn after the Dark Ages. The main goddesses of the Phoenicians were Tanit and her daughter Astarte. The goddess Tanit was the Phoenician form of the Greco-Egyptian goddess Nu or Nyx, the goddess of night and earth. Her daughter Astarte was simply the goddess Isis, Persephone in Greek myth, who is also known as Astar by the Egyptians. The god Baal of the Phoenicians was yet another form of the solar horned hunter god, he who was worshipped on Atlantis as Zagreus and Pan in his twilight version, and worshipped in the lower Egypt of the mainland as either Atem or Osiris. Tanit glyph. The Atlantean religion of the Phoenicians must have appeared most familiar to the Sardinia, who worshipped the same gods, though perhaps by slightly different names. That this is so can be seen from religious artifacts found on the island of Sardinia from all periods of inhabitation, and especially after the early Neolithic colonization by the first navigators of Nu. There was a Paleolithic population indigenous to Sardinia, though the artifacts found in their caves are not in any way exceptional regarding the religion of Anu and Nu as practiced by the subsequent early Neolithic colonists from the sea. There should have been a Paleolithic population native to most locations that the Neolithic colonists landed at, with the exception of Crete, where there was most likely no native humans inhabiting this island because of the nautical distances making Paleolithic voyages there very difficult. The new epic's cult of the religion of night was then spread throughout the entirety of the Mediterranean Sea from the early Neolithic period onwards, and did persist until the eventual collapse of the Roman Empire in the West, and even beyond this into the medieval ages in certain places of Europe. This is because the spread of weed-growing technology did not stop at the coasts of the Mediterranean Sea, but the new harvesting technology was eventually carried into the depths of Hyperborean Europe. There it illumined the evenings of this as yet still barbaric and Paleolithic wilderness with a new serpent cult form of the religion of Anu and Nu, providing bread and drink to the primitive tribes of early humans living in the caves there. Nuraghai Town Fortress. Atlantis of Hellas. Outline for section E1D. Introduction. Section 1. The Pioneer Explorers of Nu. Section 2. The Bonu Iginu Tribes. Section 3. The Ozieri Tribes. Section 4. The Sardanu Tribes. Section 5. The Tannic Settlers of Night. Section 6. On the coasts of a Paleolithic Europe. Summary.